Thank you all for being here. We've got an interesting group here today for the payer and provider venture panel. So I think maybe the best way for us to start out is just quick intros, give a quick sense of everyone's background. I know you have the bios in the program booklets, but Mike, do you want to start?
Sure. So Mike Thomas, I'm with the Inova Health System. We have two funds, a late stage fund that's $120 million, and then an early stage fund which is $30 million, and we're located in Northern Virginia.
Hi, Christiana Del Russo with Providence St. Joseph Health, which is on the West Coast, headquartered in Seattle. 7 states on the West Coast, inclusive of Montana, Alaska, Texas, California, Oregon. What am I missing? I probably missed a couple. Washington State, which is where I live. We have a $150 million fund. We're about 3 years old as a fund, and 11 investments to date.
Excuse me. I'm Tom Hawes. I partner at Sandbox Industries. We do a number of things, but germane to our conversation, we have two sets of funds. We're on our third Blue Cross Blue Shield fund, where we have 31 of the 36 Blue plans as partners, and about $270 million. And then we have a separate group and separate fund that works with Intermountain Healthcare with it's a $36 million fund. And they're looking to fund both internal and external companies.
Hi, I'm Carla Small. I'm with the Innovation and Digital Health Accelerator at Boston Children's Hospital. We're a 50-person team that's built, half of the team technologists, all about building and scaling technologies. We take technologies from inside the hospital as well as technologies from our ecosystem startups and partnership developed collaborations. And we're responsible for the digital health strategy for the hospital, as well as accelerating. We have about 11 companies in our portfolio at this point. In our first 2 years, we spun out 4, and 2 of them have raised just north of $13 million in VC fundings.
Great. And then Christy Ebong, I'm with Cedars-Sinai. I oversee emerging technology for the enterprise, so spend all my time thinking about how do we avoid death by pilot with the young companies we partner with. And we have a joint $80 million fund with Memorial Care Health System, operates as a strategic looking at provider system innovation, and then also a partnership with Techstars, where we run our accelerator program. We now have 28 companies in the last 18 months that have come through, focusing on B2B commercialization with the health system. So what we're really interested in today is exploring all things provider and payer venture. I think this is an interesting conversation in terms of timing, because 3 to 5 years ago, it was really a consumer world, and we were very focused. Everything was consumer. Rock Health was the new sexy thing on the scene. And so definitely interested to better understand, maybe we start with the provider side, what the impetus was, and Christiana, maybe you can start, where the driver is from an organizational perspective, and why a venture arm, why strategic for a provider entity specifically.
Sure. So I'd say, I'll start off by saying that there's a lot of funding that's gone into what we've categorized, and categorization is nebulous sometimes, in digital health. And there has not been a subsequent amount yet of M&A activity that is parallel this increase in funding. So there are a lot of companies that have been funded that are trying to support healthcare. And I will repeat some words that others have said recently that are kind of a revelation, that healthcare is really, really hard. And having a partner on the inside of the health system, we think, can be really beneficial to these companies that are trying to make a dent. And some of the reasons why it's really, really hard, I was trying to think of what my top 3 are lately, is that number one, entrepreneurs are trying to help healthcare do the right thing, and we don't get paid to do the right thing. And maybe my payer friends here can we can talk about that or debate that. Number 2 is that while a lot of health systems have heads of innovation and really trying to help, digitize healthcare, on the front lines of healthcare, the people in our clinics who are trying to care for patients, their job, it's nobody's job to innovate there. It's their job to take care of patients. And then the third thing that I think I'm forgetting right now, it's about the word disruption. And I think this goes back to the consumer focus, is that we're going to disrupt healthcare and we're going to blow it up. And healthcare moves glacially for many, many, many reasons, some that make a lot of sense and some don't. But it's almost iterative change as opposed to disruptive change. And I think the companies that we can help are those ones who really, as Rob Coppage from Cambio stated in a great blog post a few weeks ago, is that companies need to understand and somewhat respect the complexity. Because in other industries, maybe you take Uber as an example, sometimes early on it pays to ignore the rules and just go. Whereas in healthcare, you might get put in jail if you do that. In Uber, you might get put in jail too. We'll see. But those are just some of the kind of things where we think on the inside, having a partner on the inside that can really help navigate and help people understand that complexity is one of the reasons why we're here.
That's really interesting. I know that it's interesting because Carla's role has shifted, and what used to be really largely internal incubation focus has now expanded to be that, but also now an external acceleration focus. And so curious what the driver was for you in terms of spinning up those internal innovations, but then also recognizing that you want to really partner with external industry in that same vein.
Well, I agree with Christiana. It's all about sort of understanding the complexities of healthcare, and we felt the advantage of being able to build in situ, if you will. You know, our technologists understand not only how to integrate with EHR, but the workflow, and we can run the pilots and things like that. We were also finding that there are many of our clinicians, and then we ourselves looking out across the ecosystem, know that there are many startups that are doing things that we need to solve for. And we always, whenever we take on a new venture, do the sort of build by partner analysis. And in some cases, those are startups or larger companies with smaller ventures. And so we are able to offer a lot in terms of the tech build out and the consultation and some funding, although not to the extent that you all are talking about. But we also want to capture the value of that. So we don't want to be giving that away without seeing the upside potential.
That's great. Tom, did you want to speak a little bit to kind of the driver from the payer perspective, just in terms of why? I mean, you have a massive reach, massive scope,
Sure.
and it's been iterative over years now. So I'd be curious to learn more.
Right. So when the first Blue funds were put together, so it was actually the third attempt that we were able to get the Blue Cross Blue Shield Venture partner entity formed. So it took a long time just to get the payers to wake up, the Blues specifically, to wake up and put together an innovation program. And then they finally did it because the Blues as a group, if you put them all together, they're Fortune 3. They cover 100 million lives, and they have 90% of docs in their networks. Like they have all these big assets and things that could be great if they work together. The challenge is they're 36 separate companies. And they would, as they quite often would work with early stage and growth stage companies and help them gain traction and create a bunch of value, then Aetna or United or Humana would acquire those companies. And those would be paying, and they still are paying Optum, which is United and Aetna, billions of dollars a year. So they got frustrated with that. So much like to Carla's point, they wanted to put together a program where not only could they capture the value that they help create, but also collaborate and start to do other things together that we can talk about later. But that was the impetus. We're like, all right, this is frustrating. Let's finally put together a program where we can collaborate and invest, and then try to pick the best-in-class companies. And then, and if you think EMRs are hard to integrate with, I mean, payer systems are. We could spend an hour talking about those. It's pretty amazing. Those are some thoughts.
It's really interesting just because if you think, in that same vein of 3 to 5 years ago, everything was consumer and disruption focused. And I remember vividly having conversations at forums like this where folks said, what do you need a strategic fund? Oh, everyone has play money now. You just want to play with the big boys. And particularly in the Bay Area where I live, even though our hospital and our programs in Los Angeles, it was that same conversation around, all strategic, you're just trying to get a piece of the investment pie. I know, Mike, you have a long history of experience with growing companies, and particularly interested to understand a couple of things from Innova's perspective and the personalized approach, why the fund is the best means of doing that, and why it's such a big driver.
So we saw a couple different trends that were, some were good and opportunistic. We were trying to be opportunistic. Others we didn't like. The dearth of early stage funding, which still seems to be continuing, especially in the med tech space, is troubling. I think there was some of the more recent news. I think Kleiner backed out of their early stage or closed it up. So when you start having some of the high profile big boys like that going out, then it's not that early stage med tech is going to disappear. Innovation is still going to occur, but then they're going to be making decisions that are not necessarily the right decisions for payers and providers. They're going to be doing it based on other reasons, and we didn't see that as the right way to do it. So we thought, okay, that's one way. The other one is that we did see that there were lots of technologies that could, in addition to regulation and some of the other healthcare laws, that could put the hospital system at risk in terms of some of the ways that they generate revenue, provide services. And so rather than just be a follower and be reactive, they thought, well, let's try to figure out a way to lead. Now, Innova was definitely not a leader in terms of developing the funding. I think they were the 50th hospital system that actually put out a fund. But what they're doing, that's a little different, in addition to just trying to figure out how do we get Innova as a partner that actually generates some kind of, whether it's clinical trial work or revenue as a customer, whatever it might be. We're also looking to leverage Innova as a self-insured employer, deal with itself as a payer, and also any relationships that we have with the payers themselves. And so the perspective that Innova has taken at this point is trying to figure out, okay, from an operating perspective, how can we fill some gaps on the early stage? So the folks that they brought in were all ex-CEOs, multi-time CEOs, multi-time exits through various different disease areas. And our thought was, okay, let's try to figure out how to institutionalize this engine with a customer and the power of a dominant system. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
No, it makes sense. You backed into it, right? You
Yeah.
almost, in a way, you found folks who had been buyers multiple times, and then going at it in the other direction. I think it's interesting for us at Cedars-Sinai, and specifically for me in my role, when we're looking at technologies in the industry and we're looking to buy, and it's an immature marketplace. And there are huge barriers to entry for companies that are solving these problems. So everyone's saying, where's the next Amazon of healthcare, and why can't we get there? And ultimately, we had to make a decision that we're not going to build it ourselves, because for where we would hire a handful of folks, there's a company out there with $50 million funding trying to solve for one disease case or disease state.
One of the other areas that we did see challenging was that in the wave and a lot in Silicon Valley kind of led this in terms of the consumer-driven useless data collection era, we call it. We saw ourselves saying, okay, look, at some point people are going to get tired with the Jawbones and the Fitbits of the world, and as the data were coming out, we thought, there's a great opportunity to try to figure out how to build clinical utility out of the information or the devices. At the end of the day, a lot of it does kind of hinge on modifying patient behavior, which we'd all be trillionaires if we could figure that out. But our thought was try to figure out ways to bring prescription-based technologies to the consumer with the leveraging process of a provider or payer. Because our thought is that for too many years, and I've been a part of this in previous lives, where you build something really innovative and you charge 10 times more. Well, those days are over, at least as far as I can tell. And the days of being like the computer chip and the computer, where you bring innovation and you're trying to lower costs, you're trying to give an extremely compelling reason to a payer and to a provider and to a consumer to say, hey, look, use us, we're less expensive. Now payers will say, well, you're going to explode utilization, you're going to make my problem 10 times worse. And there's no clear answer. The thought is, well, there are some epidemiology studies, and payers look at that with the jaundiced eye and say, well, if you save money by doing this, you need to, whatever it is you're trying to do, you're going to need to prove it. But at the end of the day, our thesis is that if we can deliver low cost again, prescription grade services or technologies to consumers, we're gonna do good, but we're also gonna be able to figure out ways to create value and make some money.
So the elephant in the room behind everything you just said is it's really hard to figure out business model.
It
And
is.
so for all of you, when we had a prep conversation, the 5 of us have been talking about why is it so hard to figure out business model? What's our responsibility on the payer and provider side to figure that out? And so my question to you all is, what are those barriers of entry for the entrepreneurs? Where do you see some of those biggest challenges, also those largest opportunities in working with you all in your organizations for those young starters?
Well, sorry to dominate on this one, but it's interesting because just today and all the discussions we've had, one of the key questions we would ask the entrepreneurs or some of the companies we had talked to was, do you realize who you're taking money from?
Yeah.
And so in healthcare, it's a little backwards in that, well, it's a lot backwards, but in healthcare, the folks who are supposed to be your advocates might be the ones you're disrupting. And so the expectation is, well, you need to get the specialist behind you in order to get your CPT code and then get your medical policy behind you. Well, what if you're eliminating 80% of their revenue in the way they make money? It might help the system, might make patients better, but it doesn't make them better, so they're not going to back you. So the challenge is, from a business model perspective, is understanding where your adversaries are going to be, and then trying to figure out, there are ways around it, and there are ways to deliver good. You just have to find the people that will want it more, and it takes time. It's hard.
Sorry, but to that point, there are very few, if any, technologies or services that make everybody happy. That keep providers whole, patients better off, payers happy, et cetera, to Mike's point exactly. And so they're hard to find. It's hard to find business models that work that way, but that's why you have strategics up here on a panel, so that if you can actually get both a payer and provider in the room, then they can do their own horse trading around the technology and figure, all right, okay, if we can at least keep costs flat, and then maybe shift more of the money to your particular service or innovation, so you would be happy, and then you can keep the hospital whole. There might be a subgroup that's not happy, but at least there's more of those conversations are happening, I guess, which is encouraging to me, that you don't have to necessarily solve the unsolvable equation.
Yeah, I think those are great points, and I think as you're seeing is if you are able to find systems or entities that have those folks who sit at a level where they can guide you into, okay, well, this stakeholder will be yay and this stakeholder will be nay, and let's figure out how we're going to rectify that. So as a health system, one of the hardest things about working with the health systems like Providence is that we are massive, but it's also one of the benefits is that we have a health plan. So we can talk to our health plan folks. We have some at-risk contracts. We have specialists. We have primary care clinics. And I think who I report to is our head of digital innovation, Erin Martin, who came to Providence from Amazon. And there was intentionality around that in terms of the health system needing to understand that we need to disrupt ourselves, because if we don't, we will be left behind and we will be serving the poor and the vulnerable, which is our mission, which we will always do. But we also need to make money on the commercial side. And if we don't do that well, then we'll go out of business.
It's interesting because it begs the question of, it's one thing to do something in a disruptive state, for an example, with a primary care institution. That's just primary care, just ambulatory. I can think of an illustrative example being One Medical. But then when you introduce specialties to the mix and an enterprise organization, and how do you navigate that from taking something new and sexy when the actual business behind specialties is, as you mentioned, so different, and the revenue drivers are so different than maybe a cost savings approach on the primary care side. I know, Carla, you've had a lot of experience churning things out internally. Are you seeing opportunities, challenges in terms of the difference between the primary care and specialty side of the organization, and how do you navigate that to create business out of it?
Yeah, I was actually just thinking about the last question too, in terms of sometimes it's hard to create the business model because we're creating new things. So, we just launched Circulation, which is using Uber for non-emergency medical transport, and that's a whole different ballgame in terms of trying to navigate that. We wrote one of the earliest healthcare skills for Amazon, and now we know the potential for voice in healthcare, but talk about navigating a whole new world and figuring out what your business model is and who your buyers are going to be and what that structure looks like and all of that. So I do think some of it, while I agree with you all that it can be more iterative, it's still new, right, and new models. On the specialist versus the primary care, it's obviously so important. I do think this is when you ask what can we provide, to be able to really understand what each of them care about, how they're not just how they're compensated, but what their workflow is. I feel like that is as big sometimes as the economics, and so really helping them understand, like, A, that there is a specialist involved, and B, how the referrals go, and the whole mapping of the process is really important. And so helping them navigate that is, I think, something that we all can add.
I wouldn't understate the business model innovation part. I know it's very hard, but one of the things we've learned is that the old way of doing things, getting your patents, then getting CPT codes, and feeling as if you're protected and you're not going to get, there are too many smart people in this world now. And innovation flows so quickly now. And the way the system's set up is that you're vulnerable at all times. It seems as if to us that a bigger barrier to entry from a competitive standpoint tends to be the business model innovation. That's a lot harder because there's more art than science in that process. So we obviously are biased towards business model innovation, just because there are too many smart people out there that can figure out ways around your patents.
And I'd also say, just on the business model side too, I think what I've seen in the past few years is definitely entrepreneurs doing what they would do in any other industry, which is, and I know in Boston a hockey reference will be well recognized, is that you're trying to go to skate where the puck is going to be, right? And companies are like, well, in 3 years, this will be true. And it's not, or it hasn't been. So that fast-moving innovation in other industries and trying to get ahead of the game and be where the puck is going to be, it's been very difficult to really prove that. And those companies are sitting there and we were just outside talking about precision medicine, right? I mean, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, and it has just been really, really challenging and difficult to implement at the clinical level, even though the technology is way beyond what we ever thought it would be. So marrying that where technology is with where clinical practice is there's quite a chasm sometimes there.
So if we have all these brilliant innovators out there, and we have these behemoth organizations that we all work with, what wisdom do you have for the early stage entrepreneur in navigating the large institutions? What responsibility do we have, or what would you hope to bestow upon them to better navigate where we are?
Well, I think it's definitely incumbent upon the organization, and it seems like there are a lot more organizations to have some kind of process that helps innovation get in. So you definitely want to look for those types of organizations. I think all of us have that, so that's good. So, pat on the back. But I also think too that it's almost sales 101. You have to have a multi-pronged approach to any kind of national account process of selling. So once you find an advocate, you shouldn't be jumping for joy and just say, okay, this person's going to take care of me. You should have 3, 4, 5 dozen different points of entry into a national an account or a big strategic partner, because it takes series of decisions by groups of people, and it takes quite a bit of time to do. So the more advocates you have, the better it is, and that's a function of time. You need to spend the time to get to know folks, get to explain your innovation and what you're doing, who your initial advocates are, and then continue to build on it. So don't give up once you have one.
You can't have a panel without dissension. I would say that the point of entry is a dangerous thing. So we've been having a conversation in Boston. There's a whole initiative to stimulate more early stage digital health development, and more just as a business priority for the state to generate jobs in digital health. And if you line up the startups, they will often talk about how the innovation, or whatever the name of it, department is pretty much the last place they want to be. because it can be where you die by pilot and nothing happens. And so I completely agree with your multiple points of entry, and if somebody's coming to us, I really honestly don't want to see them until they figure it out. Who else in the hospital? And it's not me. I'm not going to use it. I'm not going to pay for it. Who in the hospital, or in the healthcare system more broadly, I'll say, is really going to be the user, payer, adopter, early adopter, later adopter? Like, figure that out. And then we'll help you navigate. But, you know, we're not going to buy it. If we're buying it, it's very short term, and don't be deceived by that, right?
It's funny, I had an interesting conversation about this earlier with another accelerator program in the opposite corner of the country from ours. And the conversation was about, you know, what is the right size for an entrepreneur in terms of an entity to start with, and where do we start? And I think a few years ago it was, if you do an accelerator program, or if you're an internal innovation, you know, which one, singular. Now we're starting to recognize there are different points of entry. For some companies, they tried a consumer model or an employer strategy, and then they got the guts to sell into provider or payer life cycles, 18, 24-month sales system. And then they went straight to venture. So it was a venture raise at that point. For others, it's earlier. They decided, you know what, our only play is a payer-provider play. That's where the business opportunity is, and so they're looking at the accelerator programs there. And so the conversation we had was about, maybe it's not a singular thing anymore. Maybe it really depends on understanding what your business is, where your portfolio company is at, and who the best partners are for them at different points in that process. And in that vein, I'm wondering if there are any specific patterns or changes in patterns in terms of your investment activities that you've been noticing, or areas of most opportunity that you're most excited about.
So a change in, so you're asking, is there a change in terms of the type or stage, or looking in terms of the?
Right, two parts. So one is, what are the companies that you're interested in? What's the best fit for your fund or your program?
Yeah, so we don't do biotech or pharma. We just don't have enough money for that. It just requires a whole different kind of expertise that we don't have. So that we don't. We deal with class 1, class 2, and de novo FDA clearances. Won't do class 3. So that makes us biased towards genomics, digital health, diagnostics, med device, med tech, health IT. We don't do any EMR related. We think there are enough EMR challenges. We deal with our own EMR. It's always a challenge. But anything in terms of dealing with AI or analytics, we're particularly interested in things like, we've seen some technologies that are looking to try to figure out how to predict your next asthma attack. We've seen a lot of sleep apnea technologies. We've seen so things that are using different forms of, we would say deep learning, but or machine learning, but it's different forms of AI that are really fascinating to us. Just because it has, not that the clinical trial or the clinical utility work is going to be any less, it's just that we do see software being as kind of a sweetener, and the analytics being the sweetener, or the algorithm work really delivering a stronger clinical utility than just the hardware part.
I would say that our sweet spot is healthcare IT and tech-enabled services. We're opportunistic around devices, but I think coming back to our scale and the scale that we can offer, it's really about how do we quickly enable the whole system to be utilizing something. And devices that tend to be in niche areas and might be more physician preference, it's a lot harder to change physician behavior than it is to maybe implement a software platform that can be used by a whole clinic or a whole practice or a whole hospital. I would say the three things that we get really excited about are that, when evaluating the business opportunity, standalone as an investment, it looks like a solid investment opportunity. The company is providing value to us as a system, and maybe we haven't proven the ROI yet, but together we can do that, and we can work with that company and help prove internally the ROI. Like you said, you got to prove it, right? It's not just, oh, this will lower costs in 10 years. It's no, excuse me, what's it going to do for us now? And then thirdly, I'd say the kind of icing on the cake is that we can provide strategic value to the company back, meaning we're going to partner closely with you and we're going to enable you to scale within our health system. And I would say the fund itself and the 5 folks that work for the fund are really, really committed to that, and we develop business development plans for all of our companies quarterly and figure out how we're going to help enable that company to be successful within the system once we've made that investment.
Yeah, what they said. It said it so well. I mean, maybe one thing I would emphasize is that we look at every company through the blue lens. Like, is there a way we can be helpful? Now, our mandate's pretty broad. We do seed stage enough to buy out and everything that's not a drug. So that's a lot. But it does get narrowed down pretty quickly if because companies need to be ready to go wrestle with a big payer. And so that typically implies you're either near FDA approval or shortly after. So then you can start your journey to reimbursement and medical policy approval. And so I love it. I love to learn. I love to look at lots of different things, but so that's a good thing. The challenge is we have to look at a lot of things. We look at maybe around 100 to 110 companies for every one we invest in.
So that brings up an interesting, the catch-22 with early stage companies especially is getting that clinical validation or getting that traction to the point where we can say, there's something here. I'm excited about it beyond just my gut. And so I'm curious how dependent, especially in the dynamic world that we live in, how dependent are your investment decisions on policy and on the current regulatory environment, and how do you navigate that with companies that you're excited about? And what are the opportunities to you as well as the risks?
Yeah, for us, I mean, we're obviously always keeping an eye on policy being so close to where policy is supposed to be made. But we don't, unless something is imminent, it's really hard to get laws passed. And although we have seen some companies and some industries, I won't say wiped out, but severely damaged, and some incredibly enabled, I'd say for the most part, if we think that there's a regulatory or legislation risk to it, we would lean even much more heavily on the management team, understanding that a Cracker Jack team can pivot and still figure out a way to build a good company and deliver good returns for an investor. So that would be the consideration, but it's it's a secondary, sometimes tertiary consideration really for us, because that's kind of hard for us to figure out.
It's similar to Christiana, what you were talking about when one of your criteria is just looking at, is it a standalone opportunity? Can you elaborate more on what you look for there?
Yeah, I guess it's evaluating the business as a business, and that goes back to, business model innovation and things. And I'd say on the regulatory side, it's, that's going to be a diligence point. Is your payment, is it at risk of the stroke of the pen? I mean, that's it. With one change, will it shut off operations and then it goes to the team? Could the team deal with that pivot and get around it? And what is their answer to, okay, if this changes? I mean, everything is at risk of the stroke of the pen in some regards, but it's how sensitive is the payment model to that risk, I guess.
It's interesting. One of the reasons I work in Los Angeles and live in San Francisco is because of two particular individuals as Cedars. One is our head of legal and tech transfer background, commercialization focus, and having that team to help navigate those challenges. And the other is on the technology side, looking at integrations and plugins to make that difference in the market. So I'm curious who some of those key players are at your organizations and in your funds in terms of really being the deal maker of where you think that partnering with the young company will help. What is it that you bring to the table, or who is it that you bring to the table that helps those companies make all the difference?
So we act as, for the early stage part of for the early stage fund, the team itself fills gaps for the early stage companies. So having done multiple different positions, the whole team figures out, okay, do you need sales, do you need marketing, business development, clinical trial work, shadow CEO, COO, whatever it might be. So that's the first wave. The second wave is we have a program at Inova. We call it a fellowship program. So we go out looking for the most innovative and entrepreneurial-minded physicians or clinicians in the system, and then we grill them, and then they become a part of the system. I mean, the fellowship program, and we lean very heavily. It's not a paid position, but these are folks that at some point understand that medicine is going to change, and they want to be a part of the change and affect the change. So they're looking at it. I mean, as one neurosurgeon told me, who's a fellow, he would love to in 7 or 9 years to actually be CEO of a company and not practice medicine anymore. That's a pretty bold statement. So we have that. That is a tremendous help because there are politics in any kind of large institution, and these folks help us navigate it, smooth things over. It also helps too for us. The CEO basically created, essentially said, look, we want innovation. This is what's going to happen, and backs us. So when we run into a roadblock, it goes all the way up, and it's we told you, and so things kind of clear up. So that helps to have the big guy at the top.
We developed this in the spirit of vetting the internal ideas, but it's started to be really valuable for the startups as well. We call it an opportunity sprint, and we bring together the technologists, the clinicians, the business people, all in a room. And we do this out of the gate, basically. So within 2 weeks of applying, someone will hear from us, and we'll have this meeting for the vast majority of applicants. And it is amazing how dynamic that discussion is, to have everyone in the room and be able to really, vet the ideas live. And for us internally, it's very important because not quite to your numbers, but we're rejecting like 95% of what we see, and we're still responsible for the innovation culture at the hospital. And so we want it to be a learning experience. But for the startups, it brings them in. And again, in this Boston ecosystem, what we hear from the startups is they just want to get in. Like, even if you don't buy them, they just want to understand. And so we bring them in and sort of open up the process for them.
Well, one of the things I think is very, that we've been extremely impressed with your program is that how you vet science projects versus businesses.
Mm-hmm.
And for us, that's been a little bit of the challenge kind of in the early stages as we try to say no to the doctors who have just science projects and try to say, look, that's not a business, that can't be a real product, there's no real end point. So, I mean, that's you guys have excelled at that.
Yeah, and these are our coworkers. Right?
Yeah, exactly. So that makes it harder.
So we have just about 10 minutes left. I want to do a quick pause and see what questions there are from the greater group. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so as everybody's sitting in a room looking for money, we can go the VC route, the family trust route, or whatever it is. When we look at, obviously, working with a system, that's a really good thing because we already have a potential customer. We can work with doctors and clinicians in a setting to adapt the product. Those are the upsides. The downsides, typically sitting in the seat, is organizational inertia. Hospitals aren't known for moving quickly, and also the issues of potential, say, competition with other systems. I don't know how real that is, but if you're innovating a product that is a true breakthrough, whether it's for Inova or Cedars, that always comes into the back of your mind. Are they really going to be unbiased on how we do that? And then the final thing is, as you're looking at the speed of actually getting in money, going through, like you were talking about, getting in and going through death by analysis, which doctors and people in hospitals typically love. Sometimes that's just not an option. That's a lot of bleed out over 6 to 8, 10 months. And so how do you address those things? Are you more autonomous from the hospital system itself or the whole system? How do you deal with that?
We actually have an interesting, we had this conversation actually in anticipation of today. I think aligning the incentives for any kind of strategic fund is really important. And what I mean by that is if you're more than a buyer, if you're an actual investor, you're incentivized and motivated to have the company not just sell to you, but to everyone else like you. So the companies, for example, that come through our accelerator or through our venture arm, we would love to send to the other providers that are up here, and payers as well, if there's a model for it, because we are investors in them as well. And so I think that's where what's so exciting for me when talking with this group of folks in anticipation of today was recognizing that we're starting to figure that out as from an institutional perspective. I don't know if that's.
We're absolutely full transparency with other systems. We have folks from, whether it's Cleveland Clinic or whatever it might be, and everyone up here, and a lot of other folks are very interested in working with us as we are with them. So there's and even in our region, so the Baltimore, D.C., Northern Virginia region, we're extremely open with everyone from Hopkins all the way down to UVA. So yeah, we haven't seen any kind of resistance.
So the investment comes first.
Yeah, the investment comes first, and the innovation. It obviously has to be something that people are interested in. But absolutely, because at the end of the day, if it truly is good, it's going to affect everyone. No one's going to keep it to themselves. It's not like Georgetown gets to keep it.
Right.
Yeah, they win, and everyone else loses.
Fair enough.
And I'd say healthcare, I think largely is still delivered pretty regionally. And so competition between
Yeah.
systems, like it exists. I mean, in our markets, Kaiser's a big competitor, but we talk to the venture fund at Kaiser all the time. And so I think we're all hoping, especially if you're an investor, I mean, we wouldn't invest in something to hold it close to the chest and keep it to ourselves. We'd want to scale it across healthcare.
That's the thing, underlying what we do is our physicians and caregivers. So, if you've got a good thing for patients, we care about it as an investor, but we care about it as caregivers. So it may be different from other industries, at least in my experience, it's a little different, particularly in pediatrics, you get to take care of children. So I do think it's not as competitive as some worlds.
Yeah, we definitely.
So we've co-invested with Aetna, with United, with Humana, so they're frenemies.
I like that.
Other questions from the room?
I'm just thinking on the startup side, I mean, you guys probably have to go through so many cold emails from these startups. Like, how do you filter them? What do you go through?
Wow. So,
What's the secret
Wow.
recipe?
so if I ever have a chance to ever write a blog, I'm going to write a blog about apologizing to all the VCs when I was a CEO, especially a young CEO,
Right.
of what I spammed them with. It's funny because it's challenging as our team. We've done turnarounds, we've done public companies, we've done VCs, we've raised, I've raised over 125 million in VC funding and public company funding. So when I look at something, I think, oh yeah, we can do that. Yeah, we can, and I look at it and we think, oh, wait a minute, we only have bandwidth for so much, we only have so much money, so then reality hits. So the funny thing is that you look at something based upon, I guess, the maximum probability of what you can outperform, achieve for them. And it doesn't mean that all the other ones that you say no to are not good or great potential businesses. It's kind of a function of bandwidth and just time, and it's hard. I have to say, I mean, I didn't grow up on the VC side, I grew up on the other side, and I look back and think, wow, what I used to do as a newbie CEO to some of the poor VCs. Anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's hard. I kind of, the way I look at it is, you kind of look at what can you maximize the improvement, and then I always try to give some kind of basic feedback to say, hey, look, here's my 2 cents. I would do 1, 2, and 3 first, and then come back again. And because that will mitigate some risk and do something that would make it better for me.
And then one thing, we actually just as a team, my team, looked at, of the 40 investments we made, how did we meet all of the entrepreneurs? And 1 out of the 40 came in by an email. So then you got to think about what are all the other ways. So we had 6 or 7 that were warm introductions from a friend of a friend, or semi-warm, I guess. 6 or 7 were from other VCs, other private equity firms. Conferences like this, actually.
We were told they were all from the show.
Yeah. So some actually came through conferences, and then there's a couple other connections. Either depends on the different groups of friends, I guess. Other VCs, other entrepreneurs, folks that we've backed that have gone on and started another business we backed again. So you have to just try lots of different things.
And I'd say as well, I think things that pique my interest is if I do get a cold email, it's, we have been working with such and such physician in your system. We've been working with this clinic or the, and one physician alone thinking it's compelling isn't going to get it across the finish line, but it's somebody that I can go to internally and say, tell me about the value proposition and what's compelling to you.
Yeah, last question, sure.
I'm just wondering, I see the 5 of you here, and is there a large, does every big hospital system have one of you guys? All the insurance companies, I really don't know about this world.
It's an interesting question, you know, does every provider and payer have a fund now? I think there's definitely a trend in that direction. But what's interesting, at least from where we're sitting, you know, for our accelerator alone, we'll bring in 10 companies every 8 or 9 months. If we have 600 companies apply for those 10 slots, we're talking to 1,000. And so what we're starting to see is that synergy and communication across entities, whether it's across venture arms, you know, and there's a blurry line now too of what's seed stage or an A round for one type of company could be a early B for another company. The amount of money you need to raise for digital health is going to be much less in general than med device. And so we've started to see a lot of network effect and collaboration amongst the investment entities of these institutions, at least from Cedar's perspective, just because, you know, there are so many really interesting companies out there, and we have critical mass where there's only so much we can take in at a given moment. So we're starting to share more deal flow.
Yeah, and I'd say a lot of systems anyway. Some have dedicated funds. Some of them do more off the balance sheet opportunistic investing, but a fair number do make investments.
Yeah. The corporate VC is pretty cyclical, so I think we're like up here and
The trough
come back down.
The trough is good.
Because as Christiana mentioned earlier, there's been so much funding and not enough liquidity, so that's going to end at some point if you don't actually buy low, sell high enough. These programs typically get shut down. But I think we're maybe still adding some more, but it's probably going to pop.
On that note, I think we'll all stick around for a few minutes. Thank you all for joining us today.